Senate Bill 2110. Recognize Senator Johnson explain the bill.
Equally uncontroversial.
Mr. Chairman, may I, on that bill, may I,
On the previous one, 1371,
no, sir, on 2110, a moment of personal privilege, if I may, Mr.
you
Chairman.
certainly may.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, and I've spoken with both Chair Schwartner and Senator Johnson. This bill had originally been assigned to Natural Resources, and it is my error and thus my apology to the committee that my understanding of the bill was different when I made the agreement to send it to Business and Commerce as opposed to retaining it in Natural Resources and Economic Development. I believe, and I have a concern that I've shared with Senator Johnson, that while I had originally interpreted the bill as more of a local issue, that I believe there's a larger statewide ramification, not just for an individual power plant in Dallas County, not just for the 12% of gas and pipelines that serve our power generators, but the other remaining 88% of the pipelines and gas industry that move gas and other natural resource products around the world. So what I'm asking of the committee is not per se a vote at this particular moment, but I want all of the committee members to understand that I interpret this bill as a major restructure of our gas, oil industry, particularly as it relates to pipelines, and that I've been as aware of that as I am today. 3 weeks ago, I would not have moved the bill to Business and Commerce. So I would want to make sure that the committee is aware of my concerns, that I would not want my mistake, for which I apologized to the committee, Senator Johnson, Senator Schwartner. I would not want my mistake to metastasize in the committee, nor the committee to make the same mistake and metastasize it to the Senate. But with that, I would want to have full hearing, have the discussion. Industry's here. Let's have the discussion on the issue. But I am highly concerned with this bill, and I would like the members to understand that caution as your Chair of Natural Resources and Economic Development. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the personal privilege.
Thank you. You want to pass the gavel back?
No, it's okay. You can recognize me on,
Well, we're on 2110 right
we're
now.
already, okay. Well, let's keep going.
Okay, so
Yeah, I'll take the gavel back.
we did just open it up. Oh, you did want the gavel back?
Yeah.
All right.
Have we already laid it out?
But just starting, and we had a dialogue with Senator Birdwell.
Right. We appreciate that, Senator Birdwell. Johnson, you're recognized to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members, and thank you, Senator Birdwell, for the personal respect of our conversation beforehand, despite our deep disagreement about the effect of this bill. It's a pretty good seg to starting it off. There are those who think, and we'll hear some people today say it's a major restructuring of gas regulation. I think it's actually extremely narrow. It's not limited to one geographic region, but it's limited to a very narrow set of market conditions, and that is a place where competition does not exist. We have statutes in place that govern this areas where there is no actual competition in the delivery of natural gas via intrastate pipelines. That is Chapter 104 of the Utilities Code. We'll get into the statutory provisions shortly in the bill and the committee sub. In fact, should we just send up the committee sub?
Yeah, we got to deliver.
There is a committee sub.
And Johnson, you sent the committee sub, and then adopted. Objection, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senate Bill 2110 concerns the effective, efficient delivery of natural gas, in particular to power generation facilities. The reason we're having the hearing in this committee today is we spent a great deal of time on the subject of power generation. In particular, we spent a great deal of time trying to figure out how we can increase investment in construction and maintenance and retention of natural gas-fired electricity generation. That is essential in that context, that we have reliable delivery of natural gas that's not subject to market abuse. During the interim between last session and this one, this committee has explored in public hearings and in private meetings the question of market conditions on intrastate natural gas pipelines. It's been a very interesting, healthy discussion, and that conversation continues. This bill addresses a narrower question, that is specifically whether legacy infrastructure planning and historical siting decisions of generation plants from the old days of regulating utilities combined with market consolidation over recent decades, has over time given rise to uncompetitive market conditions and the abuse of market power in a limited set of geographic regions. We held hearings on that subject during the interim. We are not, however, the first Texas legislature to address the potential abuse of market power in pipeline delivery of natural gas. In fact, it was the 75th legislature in 1997, that charged the Railroad Commission with ensuring open, quote, just and reasonable rates. And it was not a coincidence that that legislature enacted this provision at the same time they were having the conversation around deregulating the electricity market. They recognized that the efficient functioning of the electricity market depends on the supply of natural gas not being vulnerable to abuses of market power. Did it work? In recent years, we have seen evidence that it wasn't adequate to the task. We've had testimony about it. We're going to hear testimony about it today. The gist of the problem is this. The Railroad Commission has taken the position, observable in its hearings and stated out loud in hearings, that if a given rate of transport on an interstate gas pipeline is part of a contract, and they all are, then that rate was the subject of negotiation. And if it was the subject of negotiation, then it is presumed to be just and reasonable. But this begs the question, because the contract itself might be the product of the abuse of market power. This is precisely what the statutes were intended to address. We discussed this problem with the Railroad Commission during our interim hearings, and we were told that if we wanted materially different action by the Commission, we would need a clearer statute. And so we have here today Senate Bill 2110 in an attempt to deliver a clearer statute to allow the Railroad Commission to effectuate the purposes the just and reasonable statute was created for back in 1997. Concerns we might have. Will the availability of some sort of meaningful, effective redress under the Railroad Commission cause generators to make reckless investment decisions down the line, distort the markets so that they would cite power generation on intrastate gas pipelines, counting on the idea that the Railroad Commission is going to bail them out of every competitive market situation? That seems fanciful. The Railroad Commission, to my knowledge, has not been accused of disfavoring the natural gas industry. The idea that we might actually have generation sited along intrastate pipelines in Texas with less fear of market abuse, where many regions are served only by interstate gas pipelines, and we have a wonderful intrastate gas pipeline system, is actually a desirable end rather than an undesirable end. We're not trying to replace competition with regulation. We are trying to ensure that in the absence of market conditions, where people are depending on the efficient commercial delivery of natural gas, we have a regulatory mechanism to ensure that people that people are not subsidizing the profits that are extracted through the abuse of market power. In the absence of abuse, the statute won't harm anybody. In the presence of abuse, it gives some sort of mechanism. As for the scope of it, again, we're talking about the very limited number of instances where we don't have competitive market decisions. Past business decisions made in 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s about where things were cited, it's not satisfactory for us to say, well, that's the market. If we've seen consolidation and we've seen investment a long, long time ago, and we now have this vulnerable position where a plant is subject to the whims of disproportionate market power, it's not enough for us to shrug our shoulders and say, well, that's just the price we pay, because it's the price that we pay. It's not between those two entities. Because a generator who has to pay too much money for natural gas, paying something other than a not just and reasonable rate, is going to put it into the price of electricity, which means consumers are going to pay for it. So those two contracting parties are not the only two parties we're worried about. That's why we have a statute. We as legislators, we don't work for oil and gas industries, pipelines, or generators. We work for the public, and this bill is designed to ensure that the public is not paying the price of market conditions that have been distorted over time. Members, I'll pause there and let's take it from the witnesses. All right, I'll actually answer any questions if I have questions.
Members, questions about the committee substitute? Okay. We'll let the witnesses give us some insight. Cyrus Reed, Chris Terry, Larry Bell, Vincent Cosimo. Welcome all.
Thank you.
You recognized?
Yeah, thank you for the record. Cyrus Reed, Lone Star Chapter of the Sierra Club, for committee substitute to SB 2110. The Sierra Club does not represent oil and gas companies or generators. I'm here really because I think this bill will help the public. and it will help the public in two ways. The first, as Senator Johnson mentioned, we want to make sure that power plants aren't stuck with paying more than they should be for gas, because that ultimately can hurt consumers, whether they're whether they're operating in the wholesale competitive market, or they have a contract, or they're rucked and have to recover, and those costs get recovered through everyone's rate. The second way it can impact consumers, you might not think about, but it has to do with everything we've talked about in this committee, resource adequacy. Because if the price becomes too high from that monopoly gas line into that power plant, and the power plant decides, you know what, I can't afford to operate anymore, or I'm only going to operate seasonally when prices are really high, that impacts the amount of what we've talked about all session, dispatchable generation on the system. So, might be strange that I'm here on this bill, but for those two reasons, we are supportive of the bill. I had written testimony, but somewhere in the course of the day, it got lost, but I did send it to your staff. So it would have been a nice colored paper. Thanks so much.
Chris Terry?
Yes, sir. Chris Terry, on behalf of the Texas Oil and Gas Association, who opposes Senate Bill 2110. Senate Bill 2110 would eliminate the existing statutory requirement that a negotiated gas transportation rate is just and reasonable, making a pipeline's rates potentially more susceptible to complaints from shippers and ultimately litigation after a gas transportation bill agreement has been executed. The bill undermines the basic philosophy underlying the market-driven principles that the legislature intended to govern the Texas gas pipeline utilities. The statutory presumption that the rate is reasonable exists because it was negotiated by sophisticated counterparties. The Commission has no ability to evaluate what a similarly situated shipper is based upon its 13 criteria in its rules without understanding them in the context of the commercial situation, which would require evidence in a hearing. And the same is true for even an interim rate. This bill opens the door for customers to initiate a complaint about their rate years after the agreement has been entered into with no statute of limitations associated with it. And the real danger of this bill is that it will impede the development of new gas-fired electric generation facilities that have only one pipeline connection. Imagine a situation where a new plant's going in, a pipeline has to be built to that facility, only one pipeline, and they agree upon it, and they agree upon that contract, but when the pipeline company goes to its lender and explains that eventually that contract could be challenged, how many lenders do you think are going to want to sign on for financing that type of a pipeline? There has been no demonstration that the historical remedy for discrimination at the Railroad Commission, which is filing a complaint, having a hearing adjudicated, has been unsuccessful. Many large consumers take on the single pipeline risk because they can find other ways to back up their needs. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Members' questions of Representative Tex Southern? Very good. Go ahead, sir.
All right, I'm Larry Bell with Kinder Morgan. I represent our Texas Intrastate Pipelines. I have worked the Texas Intrastate Pipelines solely for the last 34 years. There is a formal complaint process with the Texas Railroad Commission, and in that 34 years of my career, I have never had a complaint that I had to address. I feel like that the negotiated rates are fair and reasonable and are justified by that complaint process. If it was not fair and reasonable, I think it's sometime in my 34 years, we would have a complaint filed against us. I also feel like that our Texas intrastate market is very efficient. It gets infrastructure built, which supports the growth across this state. In my 34-year career, I've seen our intrastate system grow from less than 2 BCF a day to over 8 BCF a day. Not because the system is not fair and reasonable. It is very fair and reasonable. And the negotiated rates support that.
Mr. Chairman?
Senator?
I appreciate both the Texoga witness and the Kinder Morgan witness being here and the cool conversation. So let me just ask you, are both of you taking the position there's never been market abuses in interstate pipelines, particularly with respect to generators where there's a single line going in there?
My experience, that is correct. There has been no market abuse.
So your personal experience, are you aware of any other in the state of Texas in the past 20 years? Or has there been zero, to your knowledge, not with Kinder Morgan, but with anybody, ever, an abuse of market power due to essentially a monopoly pipeline leading to a generator?
I don't feel so. I don't feel like there has been.
You're not aware of one?
I am not aware of one. I can guarantee you that is not the case with Kinder Morgan.
All right, so if I set a speed limit of 100 miles an hour and no one drives 100, no one should be worried about the new speed limit, right? I shouldn't play games. If everybody's being just and reasonable, no one's going to get caught up in the statute. Would you agree with that? I have a feeling that our representative from Texoga would not agree with that.
You're right, I don't.
Please explain.
Because I think it's a cudgel that can be used to extract a rate that is not necessarily a freely negotiated rate. In other words, you now have shifted this burden to a pipeline company. You think you're helping the electric generator, but all you've done is flip this burden. And I'm aware, of course, of the dispute between Energy Transfer and Vistra. It was all over the Dallas Morning News. You could not avoid being aware of it, right? But I'm also aware that eventually got resolved at the Railroad Commission.
It was a tweet by Commissioner Christian that apparently resolved it, seemed to be, right?
That part I'm not aware of.
Are you
I do
aware
know
that
there was a
dispute
negotiated
centered
agreement.
around an operational flow order dispute of $20 million paltry dollars in the context of the billions that were lost during Uri, and that Energy Transfer effectively said we're going to not deliver gas to that generator until that's paid? Does that not sound like an abuse of market power?
I'm not aware of that circumstance.
Okay, and it's not all about that, honestly. There are a lot of really good operators in this space, and this bill will not trip any of them up. But if people do want to abuse their market power, we need a mechanism by which the Railroad Commission can enforce it, and they told us, love to help you, need a better statute. And if you're concerned that the Railroad Commission is going to be turned into a cudgel against the oil and gas industry, I don't share your concern. I appreciate your thoughts, and maybe we should put a statute of limitations on here. There may be other things I can do to this bill that would make it more palatable to you. I don't think you'll ever support it, but I've already had conversations with Texoga. I will have more. I failed to lay out during my layout to point out some changes in the committee sub. There was actually a drafting error. We had mandatory, essentially, we made private contracts subject to public disclosure, which was unintentional. That's taken out of the committee sub. We took out the DTPA sections at the end. I'm willing to continue to work with you, but I find it troubling to think that anybody would be worried that the balance of power is going to shift to the customers where there's a single pipeline.
Anytime you can undo an existing contract retroactively, it's a volatile situation.
I agree with that, but you're also presupposing that contract was entered into in competitive conditions rather than non-competitive conditions, and this is intended to address non-competitive conditions. We wouldn't just be turning over every contract. Most of the state is competitive. So,
Well, I just want to make sure that you understand that Kinder Morgan serves over 24,000 megawatts of generation capacity. A lot of that singly connected to us, and there was no complaint during Uri about receiving every bit of molecules that they had within our pipe.
then I expect.
And we've also connected additional 2,500 megawatts of new generation in the last few years, so that are solely connected.
I hope you'll continue connecting and continue charging just and reasonable rates, and then the statute won't have any effect on you. You're doing great work. Please keep it up.
Mr. Senator Birdwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask the Texoga representative. The Railroad Commission currently has a discriminatory rate complaint process. How would this be different from the existing process?
My understanding of the way in which this bill would be different, and feel free to correct me if you think I'm misunderstanding of it, but my understanding is that the pipeline company would now have the burden, if a complaint was filed, the pipeline company would have the burden to come in and give the Railroad Commission contracts, private, probably confidential contracts from other parties, showing that those other shippers are similarly situated and that it is charging a rate to the complaining entity that's comparable to the rates it already has in effect in other private contracts.
So the the rate complaint process would turn proprietary information into public information.
Well, unless you all find some way to keep it out. It's just my concern is once you start going into a hearing in that kind of environment, proprietary information is likely to become public. That's right.
Well, and that's a valid concern, Senator. I just want to say it's in the committee sub, it's not public.
Sandberg was before.
Would setting, I think when Senator Johnson and I were talking before the hearing, while I think the tactical operation of his bill is a local issue, my fear is that you set the precedent for turning any contract into being renegotiated in the middle of the contract by the state's order. And so it isn't just on a single plant in Dallas. It's on all the plants, because 12% of our gas industry goes to the power generators. But the other 88% goes everywhere else around the world. And that's why I think we'd be setting a condition that while the bill does not tactically direct that, it strategically sets the conditions, and I want your response. It sets the conditions for any party to a contract that negotiated a contract to renegotiate during the life of the contract, rather than doing so at the completion of the contract, thus setting conditions for every parts per billion of every amount of gas going through our pipelines to be subject to renegotiation. Is that a correct assessment on my part?
I think it is if you limit your assessment to those facilities, those customers who are connected to only one gas pipeline. And you just heard how Enterprise is connected to a number of facilities with only one pipeline connection. So it's not just electric generators, but this is written in a way that it would be, for example, I have personal experience with refineries and chemical plants. Many of those only have one pipeline connection. That's not uncommon. So I think that this is written, much more broadly than perhaps has been considered.
Is there any concern of this creating, I have this concern, but would this create uncertainty in the market where you would, should this bill become law, you actually create a disincentive to additional power generation, construction of pipelines, et cetera?
These gentlemen may be better qualified to speak to that. I certainly, from my
You're
perspective.
hitting on all the questions. Yes. My answer would be yes. And I'm
You
happy to
haven't
identify
testified
myself.
yet, sir, so
Right.
if you'd state your name for the record.
Yes,
and
I
give the
will.
answer.
So I'm Vincent DeCom.
Testimony, so we just kind of clear the deck here.
Sure.
That'd be great. And then
Thank you.
we can all ask questions of the panel or of each other if we want with the bill author. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Vincent DeCosimo, and today I'm testifying on behalf of my company, which is Targa Resources Corp., and we're opposed to this bill. And as a follow-on to the conversation that was just at hand, yes, we believe what would happen here is that, as Ms. Terry said, it becomes difficult if you're going in, and even in the sense of large investment-grade companies, which we are an investment-grade company, it certainly would have an impact on our credit rating in terms of where the lifespan of our pipelines actually would be considered viable, if in fact that the contracts could be set aside or renegotiated based on what we went into those contracts, assuming we had the economics on. Backing up a little bit, I think that, SB 3, I was here, Darren Urey testified several times. I think SB 3 had a lot of great stuff in it and a lot of things that have been employed. We've had a really hot summer. We've had 2 events this past winter. We continue to keep the grid up and we continue to keep the system going, and I think a lot of great things have happened. I would say this bill is essentially, in my opinion, our opinion, a target trying to be very secular and sort out a single issue as opposed to really trying to solve a bigger problem. And the problem that we've been trying to solve, I think, since Urey was how do we get more gas? How do we get more electrons? How do we make it durability? Where's the reliability? Where's reliance? And how do we have a robust system, not just for Texas for this year or next year, but for the next 50 years? And I don't think this bill adds anything to it. So when we look at this bill, it becomes contrition in a sense. It shifts all of the risk frankly, from the pipelines. When we go out, we have the risk up front. We do contracts with sophisticated parties. And I think you also have to understand that that contract is usually for a pipeline tariff, and then their ability to buy gas is a different issue. And so I hear, well, they're stuck with expensive gas from the gentleman at the end. And I think we need to be understanding that there is a decoupling of the commodity from the tariff on the pipeline as well. Thank you very much. I'm also willing to continue testimony or have questions. Thank you.
Vincent, are you familiar with Section 104.151 of the Utilities Code regarding unreasonable or violative existing rates?
I could not recite that for you. But
Oh,
I am
and I'm
familiar
not
with
trying to
it.
set you up. I guess I'll just not be coy about this. There's been concerns expressed here from the dais and from the table there that we're going to expose contracts to being rewritten after the fact.
Correct.
I'll present you the statute. If the regulatory authority, that being the Railroad Commission, on its own motion or on a complaint by an affected person, after reasonable notice and a hearing, finds that the existing rates, i.e. the contract of a gas utility for a service, are unreasonable or in violation of law, the regulatory authority shall enter an order establishing the just and reasonable rates to be observed thereafter. So today, all of these contracts are already subject to the horrors that we've been hearing about. All I'm doing is specifying the conditions under which that authority will be exercised. Right? You face that problem today.
We do face that problem, and with respect to that, sir, I think there's only been 2 cases ever brought to the Railroad Commission that it was not a just and reasonable rate, and they were solved.
And we may get
This-
some testimony
this-
as to why it's only been 2 cases.
This bill opens up an entire set of new guidelines in addition to provisions that are already established in that particular provision. This has additional penalties that are also established in it, so there's pancaking of not only the penalty that would have been provided or a renegotiation by the Railroad Commission with the 2 parties. Now you have an additional penalty provision
Correct.
that's also included in it.
Well, not a penalty, it's a compensatory damages provision.
Yes,
But
compensatory
you're right, it is a new
damages. That's
provision
correct.
regarding the.
Right, so it isn't exactly apples to apples is all I'm trying to establish.
It's like a bigger apple.
That would be called New York.
And I also want to clarify, this is not about Kinder Morgan. It's not about North Texas. It is, Senator Birdwell, you're correct. It has statewide implications, and it's intended to. It's intended to govern just and reasonable rates, to give the Railroad Commission the authority it needs to carry out the intent as expressed in 1997, that we have just and reasonable rates in non-competitive areas. I have another question at the moment.
Okay. Any other questions? Senator Zaffarani?
Or Ms. Terry, or whoever would like to answer, how does this bill compare to similar statutes in other states?
I would say that in terms of regulatory process, the one state, I would be more familiar with Oklahoma than other states. I'm not aware, for example, that the Public Utility Commission in Oklahoma would have the authority to retroactively change the rate under a freely negotiated pipeline contract.
Thank you.
But those rates there in Oklahoma, are they not regulated?
Actually, they're similar to Texas, and where it's not serving a local distribution company, those rates are also negotiated rates.
They are negotiated rates.
Does Pennsylvania or Ohio or any other state have a similar statute? Do you know of? Any?
I am not aware, one way or the other, frankly, Senator.
Could any panelist answer?
I'm not aware.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Does anyone want to speak to the concern I've heard of industries, in this case, gas power plants, that are unable to obtain firm transport and firm supply, firm contracts because of their unique volatility, sometimes utilizing massive amounts, sometimes not using much, and companies not being willing to find a mechanism to account for that variability. Whereas you mentioned your industrial companies, they use a certain amount of gas pretty much all the time. That is pretty quantifiable. Does anyone want to speak to the difficulty there from
If I can.
negotiating those contracts and the perceived one-sidedness of that?
So I've had a fairly lengthy career that started on the refining side and has moved to midstream gas processing, and I've owned 5 companies of my own, as well as taking one public as an MLP. And I work for a large S-class company, S Corp company today. I would tell you that your opening statement that refineries are fairly static is not correct. Refineries run at 85%, and depending on the price of various byproducts out of it, they may drop to 60% or 70%. So they're not static always in terms of natural gas. And then also based on the crude slates that come into a refinery or a petrochemical plant, what they're doing, that will also determine how their gas streams. So they have some of the same variability. It may not be as widely variable. The delta and the beta on it may change, no doubt, but and it may be larger in the sense of how weather patterns change, but there certainly is variability. They manage those singular lines in the same way that many other customers do, whether they're a Napa Valley Vineyard who has some of the same situations. They have backup fuels on site. They will do regen in the site. They'll have some other type of standby generation that they have on site. So that is how it's solved. Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to say, there's 477,000 miles of pipeline in the state. 477,000 miles of pipeline. If a generator today feels that they don't have a just and reasonable rate, which means they think it's high, I would assume, they can certainly, quote, shop that, and they could probably go and do an RFP and say, I would like another lateral pipeline brought in here. There are a number of companies that would look at that RFP and try to decide if they could bid, if it were economic, and they could easily see if it was a just and reasonable rate without taking it to a Railroad Commission hearing, without having to do any of the provisions that are in 2110.
On our Kinder Morgan system, every power generator on our system has firm transport and firm storage to meet those variable requirements of their plant. Like at night, they'll be injecting gas into storage, and during the day, when they need the molecules to run their systems, they are pulling out of storage. So, and we are currently expanding our storage capabilities by 650 million a day of withdrawal capacity, because we really feel like that's what the state needs. And we will sell that storage service to really any and all customers that need that variable.
Your network's throughout the state, but a lot in the Houston area, correct? If I'm not mistaken, Kinder Morgan's?
What's that?
Kinder Morgan's network is throughout the state, but mainly in the Houston area as far as this.
Most of our intrastate systems along the Texas Gulf Coast, we do have a main line that goes up into East Texas.
East Texas, yeah. There's more dynamic, I think, more accessibility to storage, I believe, in that area relative to the other areas of the state, like in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. They rely not on firm storage, they rely on actual firm supply. Am I incorrect in saying that to any, can anyone speak to that?
Well, I mean, there is the ability to deliver our storage back into the Austin, San Antonio corridor, the Dallas-Fort Worth corridor. We're looking at some projects to try to make that available.
So, for example, if I'm understanding you correctly, if you have storage capacity in East Texas, you could put gas on some of those pipelines that come to Dallas in that location and essentially do what we call a backhaul. So that it's by displacement. That customer may have his gas coming in East Texas, and the company in Dallas who has gas in their pipeline will give credit to the utility company in Dallas that needs it, or their electric generator that needs it. So there are multiple ways these pipeline companies can work with a customer like that. But at the end of the day, every electric generator has to be thinking about those peaks. And I know from past years with utilities, for example, on the East Coast, those utilities had the ability in the old days to burn fuel oil so they could deal with the peaks when the big interstate pipelines could not get enough gas to them. Today, I think people are moving toward propane. And Vincent, you're probably the expert on that, not me, but they still are coming up with an alternative fuel to have on site and available to deal with emergency situations.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, appreciate it. Three more witnesses, Michelle Richmond, James Mann, and Cliff Lane. Mr. Lane, you want to start?
More than happy to. So Cliff Lange with South Texas Electric Co-op. We are for the bill. We do buy a fairly sizable amount of gas. We've got 3 generating facilities located across South Texas, one near Victoria, one south of San Antonio, and one down in the Rio Grande Valley. And those are located where they are because that's where the electrical need for the generation was. In particular, 2 of the facilities, the one south of San Antonio, was not located near any sort of pipeline infrastructure, and so we contracted to have a 52-mile pipe built to it. So it's sole source from that 52-mile pipe. Secondarily, we have our Redgate facility located down in the Rio Grande Valley. Due to constraints on the interstate system, we ultimately ended up contracting on the intrastate system and had a 25-mile pipe built to that specific facility. And our Victoria plant actually has a very short run to it on the intrastate system, too, that also interconnects upstream to an interstate pipe. This particular bill would actually help all 3 of those facilities, and that's very important to understand. Arguments for building a secondary pipe to these facilities that are located where the electrical need is not economically feasible, doesn't make sense. Retrofitting units to burn fuel oil, while we agree is a very valuable service, and the Public Utility Commission's taken great steps in terms of trying to incent additional fuel oil, is a great step forward and something I think we'll see more of in the coming future. And that's really due to a lack of capability to deliver gas when you need it most. And so that being said, our facilities would benefit from this because they all meet this 5-mile radius that exists within the context of the bill. And so we have no clue at this point in time whether we are receiving a reasonable transportation rate. Now, let's be clear, this bill is about transportation and not about supply. So there is a very clear and distinct difference there, and I want to make that abundantly clear. But the problem is when we go in to negotiate, we have no clue what that fair and reasonable rate is, and this would help uncover some of that as we move forward.
Thank you, Ms.
I
Richmond.
have a question.
Senator Colbert.
So when you say you have no idea what a fair and reasonable rate is,
So we negotiate it, and we have no understanding what other similarly situated shippers on that pipeline are paying for the same or similar service in that regard. If you go to the Railroad Commission website to try to uncover what those rates are, that's usually masked. It says it's confidential, that information's not there.
proprietary?
Proprietary, basically. So anyhow, so we're not able to understand whether we're getting a fair shake. We think we've negotiated a good deal, but we don't know whether we've negotiated a good deal. We don't know if it's in line with the market expectation or what the market has otherwise negotiated.
How long, the length of contract, what is typical?
You know, there's different durations. I can tell you that from our perspective, we've negotiated very long-term contracts, typically for the life of our facilities.
Which would be?
30 years, 20 to 30 years.
So let me get this straight. You are negotiating a contract for 30 years. Are there accelerators in there or adjustments?
And I have to be very careful about speaking specifically to contracts in that
No, because it's all
regard. So,
proprietary, and I
right.
get that.
Yeah.
So I think that's the complexity of which we talk about. Ultimately, what we're dealing with here is trying to get something fair to the consumers, because no matter what y'all all negotiate, you're passing it on
That's right.
to our constituents, whether that constituent is a manufacturing plant, whether that constituent is a home, a small business, a convenience store, whatever it is. So I think that's the hardest thing. I mean, the emails that I get right now are, oh my gosh, I can't believe what the cost of my electricity or gas or whatever they're receiving. This is from business people and homeowners. So I look forward to working with you. I'm listening. I have no stance on this bill other than just listening. Thank you.
Questions?
Senator.
Cliff, I think one of the concerns of oil and gas pipelines, and this should be taken seriously, is that shippers might abuse this statute were it to be enacted. Do you have a comment on whether or not that's a concern?
You know, I don't think that's a concern, particularly for contracts that have been negotiated for a fairly long period of time. I think what you're seeing is that for contracts that are being renegotiated for transportation, particularly post-Uri, you're seeing Anecdotally, I don't have direct experience with some of this per se, but you're seeing some very egregious pricing behaviors and so forth. So that being said, I think this would be better and more helpful on a prospective basis. It may help. There may be some entities that find that it's helpful, currently, but certainly on a prospective basis, it helps out tremendously.
Okay, and then last question on the comparative basis. The Oklahoma pipeline system is not totally akin to the Texas pipeline system.
No, Texas is very unique in that regard. There's far more, in terms of percentage-wise, we're far heavier on the intrastate system than what you see elsewhere across the country. The interstate system is far more prevalent. And of course, as you know, the interstate system is regulated by FERC. Those tariffs are set. And I understand this is not a FERC.
We're not doing.
This is not FERC by any means. And so, that being said, I will tell you this, that whenever we have discussions with our board in terms of what we're going to do next for our next dispatchable unit, whenever that may be, is that currently we're not too interested in interconnecting to an intrastate system. We look more to the interstate system as being the point where we want to interconnect because we see the protections that are afforded to us, the transparency that's afforded in that regard. And so we have far more interest in that than we do on the intrastate system at this point.
Thank you.
Senator Nichols.
I'm kind of intrigued, like Lois. I've dug into it some, but not to the degree. Obviously, some of y'all worked on this. But, I envision you're talking about building a plant way out there, away 20 miles, 25 miles out, and trying to find a pipeline company that will invest to run a line that far out. That's a big investment.
It is.
And so they're at risk of you may not be successful in your operation or as a business. And now they've invested all that money in that pipe. And so you may not be successful at all if you can't get a good rate on the pipe to start with.
That's right.
But let's say y'all come together. Now, that's one contract, that's one type of pricing. And I see that as in the future, feeder lines coming in there, saying, hey, there's a pipeline there, and they work with the pipeline company and say, I'd like to connect. Would you connect to me too? Those are much lower risk. I would expect those contracts to have a different price level.
I think that's possible, but we have no way of being able to tell whether that's the
Well,
case or not.
I mean, the first one is where the big risk is.
It is.
I'm just, if I'm investing money, I want a really good contract before I put my money in that big of a project. And so the price I charge you to do that is going to be higher probably than all the other people I hook up later. And then all of a sudden, 20 years from now, if I'm looking at what somebody's paying, you would say, you're paying way more than these people. And say, I'm not being fair, it's not fair and just.
Right.
And so where would that argument be? They may be paying twice as much as somebody that came in later. And so how are we going to gauge which price is right? Who makes that call?
Cliff, you might address it, but part of this duration of the contracts, right? Contracts aren't for 20 years. And maybe I'm not understanding the question.
Well, if you're going to invest a 25-year investment to run a pipeline out there, you're stuck with the pipeline in that investment.
That's right.
I'm going to want some kind of a contract that says you're going to take from me from 25 years.
That's right. So, yes, I mean, the pipeline company to which we interconnected obviously wanted to recover their cost. And so I assume that was fully baked into the rate for which they're charging us for transportation service. To that extent, economically, what you're saying makes sense. If you were to interconnect an additional pipe or an additional load to that pipeline system, I could conceivably see why and where they would arguably, pipes there, capacities there, arguably they would potentially charge a lower rate for that incremental service that's
Because there's a
provided.
lot less risk.
That's right. So,
And so I'm just trying to think of somebody reviewing those agreements. This one's paying 4 and this one's paying 2, saying what's fair and reasonable. Well, you got to go back to the original story. I made the original risk based on that contract. Anyway, I just
Yep.
been sitting here thinking about it in my mind.
We'll talk about it more.
Ms. Richmond?
Thank you. Michelle Richmond, Executive Director, Texas Competitive Power Advocates, and we are testifying in support of the bill. To give you some perspective, I represent 12 companies that have the majority of their power plants are natural gas power plants. They represent about 82% of the gas capacity in ERCOT, and more than 3/4 of those plants are on intrastate pipelines only. So to give you some perspective,
How many are on interstate?
77% are on intrastate pipelines. I think I want to talk about negotiated rates because I hear a lot about negotiated, and I think you've got to keep in mind that this bill is addressing areas in which you have one option of who to get your transportation from, your gas transportation. So when you talk about negotiated, if you are the party on the end of this transaction that has no visibility into any type of pricing or aspect on the system, and your choice if you want to run your power plant is to get fuel delivered from this entity or to not run your power plant, your negotiating ability is greatly diminished. And those are the situations that we're talking about, not where you have multiple options, but where you have no choice. And so it becomes a take it or leave it type of situation on the contract, and you don't know whether you're getting just and reasonable rates or not. That's the situation we're talking about. It very much impacts electric reliability, and I'll give you a quick example. We have a power plant in the Dallas area that had a notice of suspension of operations that went into effect in March of this year. It will no longer be available for year-round service in ERCOT. It will only be available for the summer months. So that's 568 megawatts, and one of the main reasons is fuel.
Thank you. Is it just and reasonable, though, for a sophisticated buyer and a sophisticated seller, what that market will bear?
I mean, is it a market? I mean, if you don't have any choice, it's not a market.
Well, didn't that company that was building that power plant that's going to Senator Nichols look at all these variables and go, do we need to do on-site? Do we need to get dual input to the plant? Do we need to lock up a firm transport 20-year contract? I don't know how they're offered, but something that protects them regarding their major substrate for their electric generation?
So for many of these plants, and if we're talking about the North Texas area in particular, many of these plants were built well before we restructured either the electric or the gas market. The pipeline into the facility was built by the legacy incumbent electric utilities. So when they built the plant,
The socialized costs?
well, and it was a brilliant siting decision because they built the pipeline into that plant. They never imagined that we would be in the situation we are. And so, if you're talking about that, I've heard multiple times build another pipe. Well, there's eminent domain involved in the middle of Dallas. I mean, that's an issue, and we've got a lot of these units are marginal to begin with.
I mean not socialized, but recoverable based in our rate-making process.
Correct, yes.
Senator Johnson or somebody?
Senator Nichols raises an interesting conversation we can have later, but Michelle's point here is that a lot of the plants that we're dealing with were constructed under a completely different regulatory regime. There was a completely different calculation, and so we can't sit here today and say, well, they made a market decision and they have to live with it, because again, it was a different market or the absence of a market. It's the absence of a market today, and they don't have to live with it. We have to live with it. But as far as new construction goes, it is a different conversation, and maybe there are things we can do in the bill to address new construction, perhaps, but I think, again, if it's done according to normal market ethics, that no one will run afoul of the statute.
Let's hear it from Mr. Mann real quick. Thank you, sir.
James Mann, Texas Pipeline Association. We are opposed to the bill. Those prior witnesses have said pretty much everything I was going to plan to say, so if I could just address some of the issues that have come up in the discussion. Senator Birdwell's exactly right. This bill doesn't apply just to power plants. It applies to every industrial and large volume customer we have that's just on one pipe. I don't know if there's hundreds of those or thousands of those, but it's not limited to a handful of power plants. Senator Nichols, I believe, is exactly correct. If I understand his example, how do we build pipe, build facilities, buy gas to serve a customer, and plan, set up the pipe, and set up the financing, and set up the assets to deliver for 20 years under a contract that can be set aside at any time? If we can't depend on our contracts, then we can't depend on all this other stuff either. I mean, how do we make commitments that bind us if our contracts are not binding? By the way, Senator Johnson, I think you're incorrect on the way the law works. The provision you read is part of the original Lloyd Doggett bill that created the PURA and the GURA. The next I think is the next session, we came in there to make this correction to that bill to make sure that our contract customers remained contract customers. Otherwise, under the original bill, the contract customers and race to contract customers had to go through the same rate making as local distribution companies, which take a year and a half, their cost of service.
Go ahead and finish.
So the whole purpose of this amendment, which is now in 104, was to allow the industry to keep doing what we've been doing for longer than I've been alive, and that is the residential customers, the ones that need protected, go through the regular rate-making process. Big industrial sophisticated customers like the electric guys who are, let's face it, bigger than the gas industry, have more money, more lawyers, would be contract customers, and the regulatory regime wouldn't get in the middle of that and destroy the contractual basis for about 80% of the gas that flows in this state. And this bill does considerable damage to that. And that's why we oppose it.
Thank you, sir. Members' questions, Senator Birdwell.
Thank you, Senator, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mann, some of the testimony we've heard talks about how rates are not known. Do pipeline companies post their rates?
Anybody in the business can know what we know with respect to the market. None of this is.
Expound on that, because that doesn't paint a picture in my head. So paint a picture in my head.
To determine what the market's doing, we look at the trading platforms. We get information from brokerages. We know what it costs to build things. We know where all that's going, except for the only thing anybody else doesn't have access to with respect to market intelligence is individual contracts on our system. We don't know what anybody else's contracts look like. Nobody else knows what our contracts look like. And that's what makes this business very competitive. What I'm having trouble really having a lot of sympathy with are folks in the electric business who are as sophisticated as any business in the United States, complaining that they can't figure out the gas market. They're electric companies with more people working on the gas side than we've got in a mid-sized pipeline. So I really don't understand that. But in any event, a Railroad Commission rate case complaint proceeding is not a process to gain market intelligence. It's to resolve a dispute. And you do have to have a way to resolve disputes. You do. If two people can't agree, somebody has to decide that, and that's the Railroad Commission. The way that process exists today. The difference between what we're doing today and this bill is, today, if you can't reach an agreement that you're happy enough with, you file your complaint with the Railroad Commission before you sign that contract, before anybody changes their position in reliance on it, before the pipeline goes out and makes any investments or signs any contracts to make sure we can serve it. Before anybody gets committed, before you borrow money, you get that resolved, and then we can do what we need to do to serve the contract the Railroad Commission's written for us. Right? That's how it works today. Under this bill, we do all that, and then a month later, 10 years later, something changes, the industry's restructured, and all of a sudden our contracts aren't dependable anymore. And that's what we really can't stand. I mean, contracts are the heart of the gas business. That's what everybody lives on. And any damage to them is like a heart attack. Any damage to them is something that we just don't think we think it'll be bad, ultimately bad for everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Johnson, Senator Menendez.
We're going to defer to
Go
Senator
ahead.
Menendez
I'm good.
first. All right. I just, so you've mentioned that the Railroad Commission decides all this stuff, and you seem to be of the position that there's adequate recourse today. I appreciate your testimony. I wondered if, I think Ms. Richmond has a response to your position, and you're welcome to respond to what she has to say. Actually, I don't run the committee, so we'll see if you're welcome to respond to what she has to say.
You're welcome to respond.
Thank you. The discussion about before you build any pipe is really irrelevant to what we're talking about. In most of these instances, you're not building a pipeline to something. This is an existing facility that has an existing pipeline that has no option on who to contract with. That is the situation we're talking about. So it's not you're going to go get financing and take risk to build the pipeline. You've not taken any risk in a lot of these situations. It was the incumbent electric utility that built it. And so that's the situation we're dealing with. I understand the concern about, well, this could be, an industrial facility. If you need to limit it to, electric generation power plants, maybe that's something that you look at doing, because this is very much linked to electric reliability. And a lot of these plants that are in this situation are plants that we rely on today to make sure we keep the power on and the AC on. They're plants that do not have the ability to determine when they're going to run or not run. They get an order from ERCOT to turn on. And we absolutely do rely on them. And so making sure that they have fair contracts after they have no option on who to get it from is really critical to ensure that you have reasonable electric consumer rates. And, to the point of new build, I think, what I hear from my member companies is that they are not interested in building new generation on intrastate pipelines. They will look to do that in areas that have a robust system. So I think this is about existing facilities that we rely on now that don't have, we're not talking about facilities that are about to be built or going to have new pipe run to them.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator?
Thank you. Ms. Redmond, so you mentioned there's a plant in Dallas that is, now you said something about as of March, it's not going to be, what was the words you said?
It will no longer be available for use year-round to ERCOT. So what they've done is they filed what is called a notice of suspension of operations.
How many megawatts do they generate there normally, or gigawatts?
568 megawatts.
568 megawatts. This is gas plant?
It's a gas plant, and it's in the heart of Dallas. And as of March 1st of this year, we will have it available in May through September.
Mm-hmm.
It will no longer be available. So this coming winter, that plant will not be available for use in ERCOT because
So there's a gas plant that will not be readily available.
that's correct.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions? Well, thank you all, panel. I appreciate the discussion about redress for just and reasonable rates. And we did hear over the interim and have testimony about the complaint process at the Railroad Commission and how that was done and how little it was utilized. And how do you make sure there is a avenue for rates that appear by some parties to be significantly in favor of one party versus the other. So I understand what you were trying to get at, Senator Johnson, and we continue to look at things. I have two other bills. So I'm going to ask Chairman